Welcome to the Deep Dive, your essential shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're asking, well, a pretty big question, right?
Yeah, a huge one.
Why do these massive, well-intended, seemingly rational schemes, things like Soviet collectivization, the Great Leap Forward, why do they so often end up as, well, just staggering human catastrophes?
It's a disturbing pattern.
We're really diving into the underlying pathology here, the core reasons for state failure on this scale. Our mission, really, is to understand how the modern state tries to simplify this incredibly complex reality we live in, to make it legible, as the sources put it.
Readable to the planners.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And why that simplification, especially when you combine it with, say, utopian ideals and authoritarian power, why it so often results in disaster.
Well, the key insight from the material is that there's a common thread. It's not just random bad luck or simple political malice.
Yeah.
There's a specific administrative logic at play. These huge failures, the ones costing millions of lives, they seem to stem from this really pernicious combination, four specific elements that have to be there.
Right. Okay. Like a recipe for disaster. So what are these four necessary pathologies?
Okay. First up, you need what's called administrative ordering. Think of these as transformative state simplifications. These are the tools.
Like what kind of tools?
Tax rolls, maps, censuses, standard weights and measures. On their own, they can be neutral, even essential for a functioning state. But they are the necessary infrastructure for these schemes.
Got it. The basic building blocks. What's second?
Second is high-modernist ideology. Now, this is crucial. It's this almost blinding faith in scientific and technical progress.
Okay.
The belief that experts, using rational design, can and should completely redesign society, nature, everything, to achieve some kind of perfect efficiency or harmony.
So it's that utopian impulse coupled with this, well, staggering self-confidence that you've actually figured it all out, that you have the final answer.
Precisely. That's the ideological engine. But, ideas aren't enough on their own.
Right. You need power.
Exactly. Third element, the authoritarian state, the sheer will and capacity to act on that high modernist desire to impose the grand blueprint from the top down without messy politics or local input getting in the way.
And the fourth piece?
A prostrate civil society. Basically, a population that lacks the organization or the capacity to resist or even effectively question these massive state plans. This often happens after major upheavals like wars or revolutions when society's kind of weakened.
Wow. So you need the tools, the ideology, the power, and a lack of resistance.
That's the combination.
And the real tragedy, as our sources frame it, is that this whole formal, planned system, this grand vision, it's often parasitic on informal processing. Processes it can't create itself and actually ends up destroying, like drawing a neat map that kills the living landscape it's supposed to represent.
That's a very good way to put it.
So to really get this idea of simplification, we probably need to start where the state first tried to impose this kind of legibility. And that apparently starts with trees, like the forest.
Yeah, it's a fantastic starting point. We're talking about scientific forestry, developed mainly in Prussia and Saxony, late 18th century, say 1765 to 1800.
Okay, why forestry?
It perfectly illustrates the state's initial viewpoint, what the sources call the fiscal lens.
Yeah.
The early modern state looked at a forest, a complex ancient ecosystem, and it basically saw a source of revenue. All that incredible diversity, different trees, plants, animals, how local people used it for grazing or firewood, all of that complexity was just boiled down, resolved into a single number.
Let's guess. Timber yield.
Exactly. The annual revenue yield of timber. That's what mattered. Everything else was, well, illegible, invisible to the state's accounts.
Unless it was poaching, I suppose, because that would hit the revenue number.
Precisely. Anything that interfered with the timber revenue was noted. Everything else, the intricate local uses, the ecology, just noise.
So they see the forest as a money machine. What's the next step?
The next step was decisive. Using state power and the principles of geometry and measurement, forest science started to physically change the forest, to make the real forest match the simplified administrative grid. They cleared out the underbrush. They drastically reduced the number of species, often aiming for a monoculture, just one valuable type of tree, like Norway spruce.
Oh, okay.
And they planted everything at the same time in neat, straight rows.
Yeah.
Like a grid. It transformed this abstract idea, the normal balm or standard tree, into a physical, uniform reality.
So they literally engineered nature to be legible, simplified the forest into, what was it, a one-commodity machine.
That's the phrase, a machine that could be easily measured, managed, codified, and taught. It became a rigorous technical discipline, cameral science they called it, designed for state administration.
But there has to be a catch, right? Nature usually pushes back against that level of simplification.
Oh, there was a huge catch. These radically simplified forests, well, they courted radical risks. Uniformity meant uniform vulnerability.
Ah, like if one tree gets sick.
They all get sick. If a particular pest or blight appeared, it could sweep through the entire stand. That complex, messy, real-world ecology, everything that lay outside the brackets of their neat formulas, it came back to haunt them.
So it created these brittle, fragile systems, a bit like modern industrial farms, maybe, monocultures.
Very similar dynamic, highly productive under ideal conditions, maybe, but incredibly vulnerable to shocks. The simplification had a hidden and very high cost.
Okay, so if the state can impose this rigid, legible grid on nature, on a forest, the next logical target has to be society itself, right? People.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you make people and their activities legible to the state? That requires forging the tools, the standard units, measurement, and identity.
Right, you can't run a modern state without standard ways to count and measure things.
Exactly. Think about it. How do you tax people effectively? Or conscript soldiers, or even just record property ownership, if you can't count reliably or measure things consistently?
It must have been chaotic before standardization.
Utterly. In early modern Europe, measurements were incredibly local, often based on human scale like a stone's throw, and very negotiable. Our sources give great examples from 18th century France.
Like what?
Well, the pint, a measure of volume. In Paris, it was about 0.93 liters. Elsewhere, it could be over 3 times larger, 3.33 liters.
Wow. Same name, totally different amount.
And length measures, like the un for cloth, could vary depending on what you were measuring, wool versus linen, say. For the state trying to collect taxes or regulate trade, it was fiscal chaos.
But this wasn't just random messiness, was it? There was power involved in keeping things local and variable.
Oh, absolutely. Local lords, merchants, even peasants with specific local knowledge could use this variability to their advantage. It was about control.
Any examples of that?
Yeah, the source mentions the bushel measure for grain. A feudal lord could effectively increase his rent income by maybe 25% just by insisting tenants deliver grain in heaped bushels, piled up high, instead of strike bushels leveled off flat.
Ah, subtle but significant.
Very. So standardization wasn't just some neutral technical fix. It was long, drawn-out political struggle. A constant theme, a leitmotif, the source calls it, of state building, fighting against local custom for central control.
Okay, so standardizing bushels and pints is one thing, but standardizing people seems even more fundamental and maybe harder. How did they tackle that?
This brings us to surnames, permanent inherited patronyms.
Right, last names. We take them for granted now.
But for most of European history, most people didn't have them in the way we do now. Maybe a descriptor like John the Smith or Mary from the Hill, but not fixed. Inherited names passed down the male line.
And the state needed that for?
For everything. To unambiguously identify citizens. For taxes, obviously. For church tithes. For conscription into the army. For recording land ownership and inheritance reliably. Imagine trying to keep track of people in a village where, say, 90% of the men share just 6 common first names like John or William.
Yeah, that would be an administrative nightmare.
Totally illegible from the state's perspective. So imposing permanent surnames became a major state project, really taking off from the 14th century onwards, but continuing for centuries.
And was it straightforward? Did people just adopt names?
Not always. It highlights a real shift in power. The sources point out that many early surnames weren't chosen by the people themselves. They were often administrative fictions, basically invented by clerks or officials simply to fill in the blanks on a form.
Wow. So the state literally named people to make them fit the system.
In many cases, yes. What was simplifying and efficient for the official sitting in the capital could be quite coercive, confusing, maybe even arbitrary for the person actually being named and recorded. Legibility for the state often meant disruption for the subject.
Okay, so we've got standard measure, standard names. The state is building its toolkit for seeing society. This must pave the way for tackling the legibility of space itself, right? Cities.
Exactly. The old, organic, seemingly chaotic city, think medieval London or pre-Haussmann Paris, looks very much like that messy old-growth forest to the high-modernist planner.
Tangled, inefficient, hard to navigate unless you live there.
Precisely. Illegible to outsiders. And the administrative ideal, the solution. the geometric grid.
Like a Roman camp, the castra, or, say, the layout of central Chicago. Straight lines, right angles.
That's the logic. It's easy to map, easy to divide up for administrative purposes, easy to police. And crucially, it privileges outsider knowledge, the map, the plan, over the complex, ingrained local knowledge of the inhabitants.
And the most famous example of imposing this kind of order on an existing city must be Paris, right? Under Baron Haussmann.
Absolutely. Mid-19th century, 1853 to 1869. Haussmann's transformation of Paris is a textbook case. And it wasn't just about making it look grand or improving sanitation, though those were factors.
What was the main driver, according to the sources?
It closely mirrored the scientific forestry approach. Simplification, legibility through straight lines, and centralized management. But the primary overriding goal, military security, control.
Control against its own population.
Against popular uprisings, insurrections. Remember, Paris had a history of revolution and unrest. Barricades had gone up in the narrow, winding streets something like 9 times in the preceding 25 years.
So the redesign was strategic.
Highly strategic. Haussmann's famous wide, straight boulevards weren't just for strolling. They were designed so that troops could be moved quickly from barracks straight into rebellious working-class districts to crush any unrest. They made the city, as the saying went, safe against popular insurrections.
It was architecture as counterinsurgency.
In large part, yes. The redesigned city was visually imposing, certainly, but it was also fundamentally more governable, more controllable from the center.
And this impulse, this high modernist desire to impose a rational, unified plan, it didn't stop with Haussmann, did it?
Not at all. It arguably found its most extreme and maybe terrifying expression in the 20th century with architects like Le Corbusier.
Ah, the Radiant City guy.
That's him. His concepts, like the Plan Voisin for Paris, which would have leveled much of the historic center, were based on this idea of total efficiency, total rationalization, a single, all-encompassing design imposed from above.
And he wasn't subtle about the power dynamics, was he?
Not in the slightest. His mantra was, the plan, dictator. He explicitly argued that the planner should ignore all existing ways of life, all current uses of the space, and even, chillingly, the cries of the electorate.
Wow, that's the high modernist hubris laid bare. The expert knows best and democracy just gets in the way.
It's the logical conclusion, in a way.
Okay, so we've spent this whole deep dive looking at how these states build the tools of simplification and legibility, the grids, the standards, the plans. But the catastrophe happens when these grand schemes, which rely on this abstract universal knowledge, when they completely dismiss or destroy the other kind of knowledge, right? The practical on-the-ground stuff.
Right, exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial concept from the sources, Mētis.
Mētis. M-E-T-I-S.
Yes, it's an ancient Greek term. It means something like cunning intelligence, practical skill, know-how, knack. It's the kind of wisdom you gain through hands-on experience, adapting to situations that are constantly changing, ambiguous, never quite the same twice.
So it's the opposite of book learning. It can't easily be written down in rules.
That's the key. It resists simplification into neat, deductive principles you can just teach from a textbook, because it applies to these fluid, non-repeatable contexts. It's about skill, judgment, improvisation, adaptation.
Can you give an example to make it clear? The difference between this Mētis and formal knowledge.
The source uses a great agricultural example. When early European settlers in North America needed to know the right time to plant corn, what was the advice they got from Native Americans?
I think I read this. Something about trees.
Plant when the oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear.
Right.
Now that is Mētis. It's local, depends on your oaks. It's ecological ties planting to the broader rhythm of the seasons. It's incredibly effective. And it's economical. You just need to look at an oak tree.
Okay, I see. Practical, embedded knowledge.
Now contrast that with a scientist who later tried to define the perfect planting moment with a universal scientific formula. It involved calculating the some of the squares of the mean daily temperature above a certain baseline.
Wow. Sounds precise.
Very precise, completely universal.
Right.
Utterly useless to an ordinary farmer who doesn't have the instruments or the time for that kind of calculation. Mētis is smart because it's only as precise and complex as it needs to be for the task at hand.
Okay, that makes sense. Mētis is the practical wisdom that actually makes things work. So if these grand formal plans, the high modernist schemes, are often insufficient on their own, how do we actually prove that real-world functioning depends on this messy, informal, Mētis-based knowledge?
Well, there's a fascinating piece of real-world evidence for that. It's the phenomenon of the work-to-rule strike. In French, grève du zèle.
Work to rule. You mean when workers deliberately slow things down?
Not exactly slowing down. It's when employees decide to follow every single formal rule, every codified procedure, absolutely meticulously, to the letter.
Okay, so they're doing their jobs perfectly, by the book.
Precisely by the book. And what happens?
Things grind to a halt.
Exactly. Work often slows dramatically or stops altogether. It proves quite powerfully that actual productive work doesn't just rely on the formal rules. It depends massively on all those unwritten practices, the shortcuts, the improvisations, the shared understandings, the workarounds.
All the Mētis.
All the Mētis that the formal system doesn't capture and often implicitly discourages.
That's a brilliant illustration. So the same fatal dynamic applies to these huge state planning disasters.
It seems to. High-modernist schemes fail catastrophically when they treat people like cogs in a machine, expecting them to follow the administrative blueprint perfectly. And in doing so, they actively suppress or destroy the local practical Mētis that's essential for the system to actually function, adapt, and be efficient.
Yeah. They replace working complexity with non-working simplicity.
You could put it that way. And look at Soviet collectivization again through this lens. Was it efficient at producing food?
No, it was a disaster for agriculture. Yields plummeted or stagnated for decades.
Right. A miserable failure in terms of actual output of feeding people. But from the perspective of the central state, was it a success in other ways?
How so?
It made agricultural production legible. It made it controllable. The state could dictate cropping patterns, monitor progress on paper, and most importantly, easily appropriate the grain harvest for its own priorities, regardless of local needs or conditions.
So it achieved the state's goal of control, even if it destroyed productivity. Legibility trumped efficiency and human well-being.
It seems so. When control and appropriation become the top priorities, and the practical knowledge, the mudis of the farmers, is ignored or crushed, you inevitably get institutional rigidity, inefficiency, and ultimately failure and suffering.
This whole deep dive, it's really a sobering look at the dangers of hubris, isn't it? The limits of expert knowledge and the perils of top-down power.
Absolutely. The architects of these grand schemes, they consistently seem to believe two things.
Which were?
One, that they were far smarter, far more knowledgeable, and far-seeing than they actually were. And two,
that the people they were planning for
were far more stupid, more ignorant, and more incompetent than they actually were. They dismissed local knowledge as backward, inefficient, irrational.
And the human cost of that colossal misjudgment, that arrogance, is measured in the tragedies we started with.
Yes. The beautiful, rational, formalized map, when backed by the coercive power of the state, doesn't just represent the territory. It actively suppresses the vital living information, the Mētis, that the society needs to actually navigate that territory, to function, to adapt, to survive.
It makes me think of that powerful image from Tolstoy, from War and Peace.
Ah, yes.
The administrator, the planner, standing in a small boat, holding on to the huge ship of the people with a boat hook. As long as the ship is moving calmly in the direction he wants, he imagines his tiny efforts with the boat hook are actually moving the whole vessel. But when a storm comes up, a crisis, the great ship moves according to its own forces, its own momentum, and the administrator clinging on with his boat hook is suddenly revealed for what he is.
An insignificant, useless, feeble man. It's a devastating analogy for the limits of top-down control.
So if there's a final lesson here about building resilient societies, what is it?
Perhaps it's that the systems that truly last, the ones that can adapt and endure shocks, are often the ones that look messier on paper. Institutions that are, multifunctional, plastic, diverse, maybe like language itself, or like common law traditions.
Why those?
Because they are constantly being shaped by and incorporating the evolving modis of the people actually using them. They learn from the ground up. They represent that necessary counterpoint, flexible, adaptive, complex to the often static, brittle simplicity imposed by the state.
That's a really powerful takeaway. So maybe the challenge for us, for you listening, is next time you encounter a really rigid, top-down, schematic system in your workplace, in policy, anywhere, ask yourself, what essential practical knowledge, what vital Mētis is this beautiful rational structure ignoring or maybe even actively crushing?
That's the question to keep asking.
Thank you for diving deep with us today.